Labą dieną, gerbėmieji.
Good evening, Chairman, moderators, ladies and gentlemen. The subject which we'll look into is important. I have joined this conference recently, but I previously sent some of my ideas in English so that you heard my conceptual remarks. I was not sure whether my remarks were read or not. I know that today the new Sejm members are being sworn in, so I was not sure whether there would be any people here in the hall. Well, I will base my speech on what I wrote in my conceptual remarks. First of all, I would like to make some comments on the subject of united history. This subject draws us back to the very cornerstones of civilization of Europe. What I mean is the idea of progress. Progress is the cornerstone of European civilization. In African or other civilizations, it was not expressed. It united responsibility and individual responsibility are something important as well. Any human being is an individual, so this is why people merit respect, but they also bear responsibility. Individual responsibility. This has been formulated and endorsed by Christianity in Europe. When we talk about Western civilization, we talk about Christianity, first of all. The responsibility has been formed and is not forgotten. The responsibility is an ethical one. It arises not because of the threat by the power or threat by the king. Moral and ethical rules are inscribed in the 10 Commandments, which have been transferred to European civilization by Judaism. This is why we often call the European civilization a Judaic-Christian civilization. Christianity is important. The promise of Christianity is of importance in Europe. Through truth into freedom, this is what the promise is all about. Truth is truth, and there are not many truths, there is a single truth. What we hear today this is commitment to integrity. Integrity in the universal meaning of the word. Integrity based on the 10 Commandments. This is how we see the development or degradation of European democracy. Many individuals and their individual responsibility give rise to the collective responsibility of a community, a nation, and a state. So these are the cornerstones of our deliberations in the framework of today's conference. Democracy amounts to the right of all people to make decisions on life and matters of life. If we take the basis of Christianity and collective responsibility as well as individual responsibility of all people, this is often forgotten or undermined. Human rights are of huge importance, but responsibility is forgotten for some reason. One of the reasons why this civilization is distorting is this. So far, this is how it was formed and shaped. This was our history. In the so-called our civilization, people thought that this was the best civilization of all, and the European civilization still thinks so. There are some nations shaped by other civilizations, and they accept in part this model of European civilization. We have our own history. The European history, the history is understood and described. And later we start calling the descriptions of history history. These are texts, based on texts, and the text is a fundamental concept. History is in place when we have written sources. And before that, history is based on ethnography and archaeology. It's a matter of conflicting views, but leave it to historians. As soon as we have written sources, we can speak about history. Will we ever achieve united history? Or will there be many histories, as there are now? Social structures, such as states, define their histories and historical narratives, and by doing so, they implement their policies. If there is one human policy in place, this is a utopia, but then I think we will have the united history of events. There are two terms, the history of development and the history of events or facts. History and policy so far are intertwined, and it's quite difficult to make the distinction between the two. Even we dream about a united history of Europe, I have a question. Is it achievable at all? Since history is intertwined with policy, and policy includes lots of interpretations, differences, but it's hardly achievable to separate history from politics. Politics is about interests. And when we talk about national history or international history, interests are involved everywhere. Let's take Lithuania. We always had three imperial interests vis-à-vis Lithuania. So we had three historical interpretations of history. And we had one resistance interest, as we wanted to survive as a nation. Throughout the 19th century and even earlier, one of the interests in Lithuania was to Russify Lithuania, to implement Russification, or to implement Polonization. The if attempts to implement Russification have lasted for a long time. Even when states didn't exist, or when states have intentions of becoming a state, they have the proto-state interest. So in the 19th century, we worked for the future of the Polish state, not only through the uprising, but also through culture and through attempts to expand the cultural hegemony. We know that from our history. It's interesting that back in the Lithuanian group in Warsaw, which was established by Kudirka, one of the tasks of this group was to Lithuanize the country. In some territory. The limits of the Lithuanian nationhood was the idea that Kudirka promoted, and this was part of the proto-state policy at the time. It's quite hard to achieve a united history of Europe, but it's quite a good subject for debate. It's clear that the key problem and obstacle for the united history of Europe to exist and to come into being is the incompatibility of two vectors. These vectors are history, the history of facts, not of narratives. There are plenty narratives. The factual history, not interpretations, not narratives. And the second factor is policy, which creates the facts and narratives. The subject of our today's conference includes two important concepts: united history and united Europe. Let us look into those concepts in great detail. History can be understood as a history of nations. But what I mean by nation is not necessarily a nation state, it's just an ethnic or cultural nation. I would call that folk in English. And there is history of states. These histories don't coincide. If a country doesn't have its own state, it doesn't mean they don't have their history. And if there's a state, it doesn't mean that it's the state history is the history of one nation. Lithuania's history has involved the histories of various nations, but we are still struggling to come to terms with the many histories that took place in Lithuania before we became a state. If we take the history of states, the key paradigm of thinking and action was unfortunately the territorialism. This is my newly coined word. the states thought in territories. I don't think the territory is the most important for a state, but many people do, even today. They are ready to exterminate massive numbers of people, but achieve the fact that the territory remains the same. Whenever territories are lost, we see the same things. France lost Alsace, then Germany lost Alsace, then France lost Alsace again, and then Germany lost Alsace again with the Second World War. Each time there's a territorial loss, it is seen as a very painful defeat. So important territory is lost. Even for a square kilometer, wars may start. Even for because of 4 stones in the Sea of Japan, the Japanese government fails to make an agreement of peace or a peace treaty with another country. China and Japan were on the brink of an international conflict and war recently. So this is all about territorialism. The loss of a territory is a most painful defeat. One may pay reparations, one may have satellite colonies, but if the territory is the same, then everything is okay. This is the paradigm of thinking. As for expansion, it usually comes from victories in wars. Today, we call this expansionism. When countries are expanding in territory by incorporating the territories they never had before. The aim of an expansionist state, if it's more powerful than the neighbors, and if it's incorporating the territories of other neighbors, its aim is to incorporate, unify, mostly by force, and govern this territory. The unification goes through cultural genocide. Let's say in the 19th century, the Lithuanian press was forbidden. And Lithuania was a territory which Russia wanted to unify with Russia by force. Why is that being done? That's being done in order to be able to govern the lands and the people. Unless people resist. If people resist, then they can be exterminated because the territory, the lands, are more important than people. For the sake of governance, the people, the nations, can be physically exterminated or displaced, deported to the far-off regions of the country, because after the incorporation, this becomes one state, and the people who are not to be trusted should not be left in the same place. They should be displaced. Once people are exterminated or displaced, the territory stays in place. We still remember the gracious saying by Suslav, Lithuania without Lithuanians. successful governance of the territory proves that you are an owner, the ruler, whether you're a king or a head of state. As a result, the sovereign who governs the territory defends this territory as a sovereign territory that he owns. And the sovereign also defends the people who live on that territory. Let's remember the Grand Duke of Lithuania, Vytautas, who fought against Russia, against Moscow, because the defenders of Russia, of Moscow, ransacked the people who were under Vytautas's rule. So Vytautas asked his gender to... Okay, I will not demonstrate any more examples, but I will follow up with the one I began with. The Bykovtsa Chronicle writes that that Moscow didn't pay any heed to the letter where the ruler of Lithuania wrote his claims. So Vytautas went to fight with the Moscow rulers so that they respect him. So the sovereign defends the land because another sovereign wants to take it over and become a ruler. The current politics of the state may seem different from the past politics, but it isn't. The past is called history, but in fact, our politics today derive from our history. I have spoken about that on numerous conferences. The global wars of the 20th and 21st centuries, including the Cold War and the terrorist war, amount to one global war for global domination. New facts become history tomorrow. But politics make use of history. Politicians use history for their agendas. And since the agendas of various politics and politicians are incompatible, it's quite difficult to imagine one single united policy, because history is used as a tool for reaching the aims. Let's say President Putin ordered to rewrite all the textbooks for pupils and students by deleting any information on Russia's historical failures and the wrongdoings of the past. The history of Europe today, what does it mean? Europe. There are many Europes, but conceptually, it's important to see the two meanings of Europe: geographical Europe and the history of European culture. Europe as culture and Europe as a geographical entity. The unified European history is easier to achieve without Russia. as long as it is not a democracy with a human measures and not with just governance. Based on the political culture concept, the Russia under Vladimir Putin stands aside and seems unfriendly towards Europe as an entity of democracies. I am not being critical. I'm just talking about the values. And let's take the best known example, the Teufel Pact, or the Pact of the Satan between Hitler and Stalin. These are the words by Helmut Kohl. He said that in Bundestag on the 1st of September 1989. This is how democracies see it, but Russia sees it in a different way. Today's Russia, under Putin's ideology, sees it in a different way. They see it as a positive achievement of Russia in the past. They were ready for the war and they received territories. Of course, Teufel, Satan, was happy then, and it is still happy now. Can the united history of Europe emerge? No, not for a long time. So in ideal terms, we can speak about the common history of cultural Europe, the Europe of culture. For some, this shameful pact is part of European history, and for others, this is not history, this is hysteria. There cannot be equality between those things. I cannot even disagree with that. I am just stating the fact. Let us move on to another aspect. The united European history will be something that is possible to achieve if we take the history of peoples, not the history of states. If we were able to research and study and to prove the development in culture, the cultural development, including communications and exchange of ideas and other goods. This common history would be easier to inscribe in letters and would be more attractive. Let us leave the state histories aside. We could develop and describe the phenomena of development of culture in Europe and rejoice at that. We could see the general big picture, not just the pride or just the humiliation as a result of wars over territory. This approach should be recommended. What have we achieved in Europe in humanitarian terms is most important. How Europe helped to discover various discoveries and improve the search for the sense of life. This should receive the greatest focus. It doesn't matter who was the first to discover what. It's important that these discoveries were discovered. Even Gediminas, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, had his own concept of the sense of life. He was the most modern ruler of a European country at his own time. So it's not important who is the first one to discover things. And it doesn't mean that the one who is first to discover is the better one and receives the right to rule over the people who are lagging behind or who are weaker. Thankfully, we don't think so, even though our eastern neighbors do. New research into history would be really attractive and would make history more attractive. It would lead to something positive, to a positive and encouraging view on history and concept of history. If someone is to write a PhD paper, they should write a paper on what did European people eat, what did they consume, what ways they used to satisfy their needs, how did they invent things. In order for a nation to live, they need to eat something. What did nations discover? How did they change? What did they exchange? What did they believe? Do they still believe that? So we would have the European history, the history of European nations. How did the nations express themselves? Through language or languages, the variety of languages, and the richness of these languages. I'm not just talking about homophones or homonyms. I'm talking about things that cannot be translated and that demonstrate the richness of the human spirit. So I talked about language. What about other things? Arts, creations, history, and history of ideas, technologies. So if you are to write a PhD paper, if an institute of history is to do research and engage in that, this is the thing to be interested in. This is the history is to be promoted, not the history of wars and power struggles over territory. Thank you.
Thank you very much.